March 21, 1998. The Royal Caribbean cruise ship Rhapsody of the Seas glided smoothly across the Caribbean Sea, slicing between the idyllic islands of Aruba and Curaçao. On board, 23-year-old Amy Lynn Bradley, a bright and athletic young woman from Petersburg, Virginia, was enjoying a long-anticipated family vacation. It was supposed to be a week of celebration. Amy had recently graduated with a degree in physical education and was on the verge of starting a new job. Her parents, Ron and Iva, and younger brother Brad, had planned the cruise as a rare opportunity to unwind together before life pulled them in different directions. But just 3 days into the voyage, their world would be shattered in a way they could never have imagined. The night of March 23rd was full of music, laughter, and dancing. The cruise's nightclub, the Dance Club, pulsed with Caribbean rhythms as passengers mingled with the ship's crew. Amy, known for her independent spirit and athletic build, stood out with her short brown hair, multiple tattoos, and confident demeanor. She was seen socializing with members of the ship's band, Blue Orchid, particularly one of the bass players. Her brother Brad, who was with her most of the evening, later recalled Amy being in good spirits, relaxed, happy, and enjoying herself. Sometime around 1 a.m., Amy and Brad returned to their family's cabin. Brad fell asleep quickly, but Amy stayed up, likely restless from the adrenaline of the night. Around 5:30 a.m., Ron Bradley briefly woke up and saw Amy sitting on the balcony, gazing out at the sea. She was barefoot, wearing a white tank top and dark shorts. He drifted back to sleep, unaware that it would be the last time he would ever see his daughter. By 6 a.m., Amy was gone. Panic erupted almost instantly. The Bradleys reported her disappearance to the ship's crew, but what followed was a series of baffling delays and missteps. Ron begged the staff to prevent passengers from disembarking once the ship docked in Curaçao, fearing someone could have taken Amy ashore, but that didn't happen. The ship was cleared for port activity, and hundreds of passengers flooded off while the family desperately searched the decks. Announcements were made only much later, and even then, curiously, only in crew areas, not public ones. What made Amy's disappearance more sinister was that she wasn't your typical missing person case. She was a strong swimmer, had been a trained lifeguard, and was highly cautious of her surroundings. She had no history of mental illness or self-harm. Moreover, she left behind all her belongings: shoes, ID, cigarettes, even her room key. And then came the footage. Surveillance cameras captured Amy walking through the hallways of the ship in the early morning hours, shortly after her father had last seen her. She appeared alert and alone, but that was the last visual trace of her. Soon, whispers of something far more terrifying began to spread. Rumors that Amy had not simply vanished, but had been taken. In the hours immediately following Amy Lynn Bradley's disappearance, confusion reigned aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas. The cruise line's crew initially treated the incident with what the Bradleys would later describe as alarming nonchalance. Despite Ron Bradley's desperate pleas, the ship was not sealed, and no immediate search was launched. The family's worst fear had already begun to take root. Someone could have taken Amy off the ship, and no one was stopping them. By late morning on March 24th, ship security conducted a search, but it was superficial at best. They failed to check passenger cabins thoroughly, and the announcement about Amy's disappearance was bizarrely made in restricted crew areas only, not broadcast to passengers. It was as if the cruise line didn't want to cause alarm, or didn't want negative publicity. With every passing hour, the trail grew colder. Amy's family insisted that she wouldn't have gone overboard accidentally. Amy was a strong athlete and lifeguard. Plus, the railings on the balcony were too high for someone to fall accidentally. No evidence of a struggle, no splash heard, no belongings missing. It simply didn't add up. But things took a darker turn when fellow passengers began coming forward with odd and unsettling observations. A Canadian man reported seeing Amy walking toward an elevator early that morning with one of the ship's band members. the same bass player she'd been seen talking to the night before. He later denied involvement, but suspicion lingered. Then came the revelation that Amy had been approached by multiple crew members during the trip, some reportedly making her uncomfortable. One even allegedly asked her to pose for photos for the cruise line's brochure, which she refused. It was becoming clear Amy might have been targeted. What truly chilled investigators and the public alike were the eerie similarities between Amy's case and stories of organized trafficking rings operating in the Caribbean. Women, particularly young, athletic, and tattooed ones like Amy, were sometimes abducted and sold into human trafficking networks. Was this just a wild theory? Or had Amy been lured or forced off the ship? The ship docked in Curaçao later that day, and local authorities were brought in. The FBI, now involved, worked alongside island police, combing through the port and surrounding areas. Flyers were distributed, interviews were conducted, but there was no trace of Amy. No one had seen her disembark. No security footage showed her leaving the vessel. And yet more sightings began to trickle in. A taxi driver in Curaçao claimed a woman matching Amy's description frantically approached him that morning, asking for a phone. Before he could help, she was allegedly pulled away by two men and shoved into a car. But there was no camera, no license plate, no confirmation. The Bradley family, devastated and now suspicious of everyone, stayed on the island after the cruise departed. They combed beaches, harbors, alleyways, chasing every rumor, following every tip, praying for a miracle. Meanwhile, the cruise line quietly distanced itself, offering little support. Amy had vanished, not just physically, but from responsibility. And the people who should have protected her, who should have acted faster, were already trying to wash their hands clean. Back in the United States, the Bradley family's nightmare was only deepening. What should have been a straightforward, rapid investigation into a missing person case was turning into a bureaucratic quagmire. A slow, painful grind against a system unprepared and unwilling to deal with disappearances in international waters. Ron and Iva Bradley weren't just grieving parents. They were quickly becoming advocates, detectives, and relentless pursuers of the truth. They knew their daughter hadn't simply walked away. They knew something sinister had happened, and yet they were being met with silence, misdirection, and dead ends at every turn. By the time the FBI officially got involved, critical evidence had already been lost. The ship's crew had failed to secure the scene, failed to stop passengers from disembarking, and failed to treat the disappearance with urgency. Most of the potential suspects, especially among the crew, had left the vessel or returned to their home countries, and with no body, no crime scene, and no witnesses willing to talk, the case stalled before it had truly begun. But Amy's family refused to give up. They plastered the islands with flyers. They contacted embassies, hired private investigators, and gave interviews to major news outlets. Their story began to gain traction, and public interest exploded. Suddenly, Amy wasn't just a missing person. She was a symbol of a broader, more chilling reality. People do vanish from cruise ships, and those disappearances often go unsolved. One of the most disturbing revelations came during a televised interview. The Bradleys shared that the cruise line had tried to offer them free vacations in the aftermath of Amy's disappearance, as if a free trip could somehow make up for losing their daughter. It was a slap in the face, a cruel gesture that only cemented the family's belief that the company was more interested in preserving its reputation than in finding out what happened to Amy. Then came the calls, the tips, the impossible-to-ignore claims from strangers who believed they had seen Amy alive. A U.S. Navy petty officer came forward with a shocking story. He claimed that, in a brothel in Curaçao in 1999, over a year after Amy had disappeared, he saw a woman who looked exactly like her. She approached him, desperate, and said, "My name is Amy Bradley. Please help me." Before he could act, she was escorted away. The Navy initially dismissed the claim, but later admitted the man had passed a polygraph. Still, The brothel was gone by the time investigators followed up. Then, in 2005, a witness in Barbados claimed to have seen a woman matching Amy's description on the beach with two men, again appearing distressed. But no photo, no name, and no follow-up. Each sighting felt like hope and heartbreak intertwined. A glimpse of salvation, always just out of reach. The theory of human trafficking, once whispered, now had sharp, terrifying edges. It made sense. Amy was young, beautiful, athletic, and tattooed. Markings that would make her identifiable in the sex trade. And more than anything, she had vanished without a trace from a tightly controlled environment. If she hadn't fallen, if she hadn't run, then someone had taken her. But who? And how? And why hadn't they been stopped? The deeper her family dug, the more sinister the picture became. Cruise ships, often seen as floating paradises, operated under complex international laws. Jurisdiction was murky. Accountability was thin. Security was often outsourced or handled by the crew themselves, people who, in Amy's case, may have been involved or, at the very least, knew more than they were saying. By now, the Bradleys were convinced. Amy hadn't simply vanished. She had been hunted. As the years passed, Amy's story refused to fade quietly into the abyss. In fact, it only grew louder, whispered in forums, dissected in documentaries, shouted by her grieving family on national television. Ron and Iva Bradley became tireless campaigners, appearing on shows like America's Most Wanted, The Oprah Winfrey Show, and Dr. Phil. Each appearance wasn't just a call for help. It was a plea for justice. They didn't just want answers. They wanted accountability. And then, in 2005, something emerged that changed the tone of the entire case. A jaw-dropping email arrived at the offices of a private investigator hired by the Bradleys. Attached were photographs. Grainy, unsettling, and intimate. The woman in the images bore a chilling resemblance to Amy. She was in lingerie, posing on a bed, her face older but still unmistakably hers. These images were found on a website tied to an escort service operating out of the Caribbean. The woman was listed under the name Jazz. Investigators noted her tattoos matched Amy's, particularly the Tasmanian devil on her shoulder and the gecko on her ankle. Even her pierced navel was identical. The Bradleys were crushed, not because they doubted it was Amy, but because they believed it was. For the first time, they had visual evidence suggesting that Amy Lynn Bradley might still be alive and trapped in a hell they couldn't reach. The FBI took the photos seriously. They ran facial recognition and forensic analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The case, once cold, flared with sudden heat, but just as quickly, the momentum died. The escort site was taken down. Jazz disappeared. The trail, like so many before it, ended in silence. Amy's case exposed the uncomfortable truth about cruise ship disappearances. Since cruise lines operate under flags of convenience, in Amy's case, the ship was registered in Liberia. They're not bound by U.S. laws. Security is minimal. Crew members come from dozens of countries and often don't undergo thorough background checks. In this chaotic legal gray area, crimes can occur, and perpetrators can vanish without a trace. The cruise line, Royal Caribbean, had no obligation to take the lead in the investigation. And from the start, they seemed more invested in damage control than resolution. Meanwhile, the sightings continued. One woman, vacationing in a department store bathroom in Barbados, claimed she was approached by a woman who whispered that she was being held against her will and needed help, before two men came in and took her away. The woman later identified the missing person as Amy. Another witness said she saw Amy in a car, looking scared, sitting beside a man in Curaçao. But no tip ever produced results. The FBI began to scale back. Leads grew colder. Even seasoned investigators were baffled. How does someone vanish from a cruise ship full of people, under surveillance, within a confined space, and never reappear? For the Bradleys, the pain was endless. Their daughter had been reduced to a ghost, a story, a mystery. But to them, she wasn't a headline. She was Amy, the girl who loved basketball, the sister who danced to reggae on the deck that night, the daughter who sat quietly on the balcony before vanishing into the dawn. And every time the phone rang, they wondered, is this it? Is today the day we bring Amy home? But the calls never brought closure. Only more questions, more grief, more torment. And still, no one could explain how or why she vanished. By now, Amy Lynn Bradley's disappearance had transcended mere tragedy. It had become a case study in systemic failure. Law enforcement, cruise security, international cooperation, all had faltered. The trail of incompetence left behind was almost as disturbing as the disappearance itself. And the Bradleys were caught in the middle of it all, grieving while also fighting. Fighting for answers. Fighting to keep their daughter's name in the public eye. Fighting against a silence that grew heavier with every passing year. But just when the case seemed to be slipping into obscurity again, a new figure stepped forward. Frank Jones, a self-proclaimed ex-Army Special Forces operative, contacted the Bradleys in 2002 with what seemed like a lifeline. He claimed to have a team of operatives in the Caribbean who had located Amy. He said she was alive, being held against her will by armed captors in Curaçao, and that he could get her back. The Bradleys were skeptical, but desperate. They needed to believe. And so, they listened. Jones provided specific details, descriptions of Amy's location, the men guarding her, even snippets of conversations supposedly recorded during surveillance. He said the team was organizing a rescue mission, but he needed funding. Over the next several months, the Bradleys sent him over $200,000 to support the operation. The mission was set. Jones claimed they were ready to move in. Ron and Iva held their breath. Then, silence. Jones suddenly stopped contacting them. No updates, no mission, no Amy. Eventually, the devastating truth emerged. The entire story was a lie. Frank Jones had fabricated the entire operation. He never had a team. He never had intel. He was a con artist who preyed on a grieving family's hope. He was arrested and later sentenced to prison for mail fraud. But the damage he caused, emotionally and financially, was incalculable. For a brief moment, the Bradleys had allowed themselves to believe they were on the verge of rescuing Amy, and it had all been an illusion. Still, they pressed on. Over the years, the family created a website, raised reward money, and worked with organizations specializing in human trafficking. Amy's story was added to the FBI's most wanted missing persons list. Her case remained open, but leads were rare. Investigators agreed. There was never any evidence she had fallen overboard. There were no signs she'd left willingly, and her personality, fiercely independent, close to her family, cautious of strangers, didn't fit the profile of someone likely to run away. Even now, 2 decades later, people continue to report alleged sightings. In 2010, a woman came forward claiming she saw Amy in a Caribbean brothel years earlier, but had been too afraid to speak up. In 2020, online forums lit up again when amateur sleuths compared old cruise photos and noticed inconsistencies in who was present during certain events the night Amy disappeared. A few theorists believe multiple crew members coordinated her disappearance. A calculated abduction carried out while the ship slept. The Bradleys never embraced conspiracy. They didn't need to. The facts were chilling enough. A healthy, happy, clear-minded young woman vanished without a trace in a confined environment. She left behind no clues of a plan, no signs of distress. She simply disappeared, and someone, or something, was responsible. But in this story, the truth never surfaced, and the ocean kept its secrets. Years turned into decades. But for the Bradleys, time didn't heal. It sharpened. Every birthday that passed, every family event without Amy, every time someone asked about her, it was a reminder that the world kept moving while she remained frozen in mystery. The grief was constant, but so was the fight. They refused to let her be forgotten. In interviews, they clutched old photos, pointed to tattoos, replayed that last night again and again, always hoping that someone, somewhere, might recognize her, might remember something, might finally come forward. The FBI continued to keep the case open. Her image, digitally aged, remained on their site alongside a reward of $250,000 for credible information leading to her recovery. In every photo, she looked confident, vibrant, but also haunted. Even images from before the cruise carried a shadow, now retroactively cast by hindsight. The question always lingered: was Amy still alive? And if so, what kind of life was she living? Behind closed doors, the Bradleys imagined the worst. Human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry, rooted in secrecy, protected by fear, and governed by violence. Victims are moved, renamed, erased. It's a system designed to make people disappear. And Amy, young, athletic, educated, and strong-willed, didn't fit the typical mold of someone easily broken. Perhaps that's why she had to be hidden so well. Sightings continued to come in, though fewer with time. Most were vague, some were credible, others clearly hoaxes. But each one reignited the pain and the hope. One sighting that particularly stood out came from a Navy sailor who, long after leaving service, said the guilt had been eating at him. He believed he had truly seen Amy, and not just a look-alike, that she had spoken her name, begged for help. He'd been too afraid to act in the moment, and he had to live with that. Then there were the dreams. The Bradleys spoke of how Amy came to them in sleep, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling, always distant, always unreachable. The mind, when pushed to its limits by trauma, creates patterns, narratives, coping mechanisms. But in the case of Amy Lynn Bradley, the line between hope and delusion was razor thin. Because there were enough fragments, enough facts, sightings, inconsistencies, to believe she could be alive. That maybe, just maybe, she had survived. But survival in that context was a nightmare. If Amy had been trafficked, she was likely stripped of identity, rights, and freedom, forced into submission, drugged, threatened. The details of such systems are too horrific to spell out in full, but the reality is undeniable, and the possibility that Amy lived in that world for years, unseen and unheard, was enough to torment the family more than her death ever could. Even so, giving up was never an option. The Bradleys became experts in laws surrounding cruise ships. They worked with victim advocacy groups. They pushed for legislation to improve security and oversight on international cruises. They educated other families. In a tragic twist, Amy's case became a catalyst for change, a horrific event that forced an industry to confront its own vulnerabilities. But that didn't bring Amy back. The hardest part was the not knowing, the way a single decision, a walk through a hallway, a moment on a balcony, an encounter with the wrong person, could unravel an entire future. The last time Ron Bradley saw his daughter, she was sitting quietly, watching the sunrise over the ocean. And then she was gone. No goodbye, no warning. Just the endless echoing question: where did Amy Lynn Bradley go? As Amy's case drifted further into the realm of legend, it took on an eerie duality, both a horrifying mystery and a cautionary tale. Over time, she became a symbol, not just of loss, but of all the ways the system fails victims. She was no longer just a missing woman. She was the missing woman, the one whose name haunted travel forums, whose photo lingered in FBI archives, whose story was told in hushed tones by passengers on cruises, staring too long at the railings and wondering if they really were safe. Amy's name became shorthand for the hidden dangers that lurk even in paradise. And yet, despite the mythologizing, her family never let the real Amy get lost in the noise. They constantly reminded the world who she was. A fiercely independent 23-year-old who loved animals, played basketball, and laughed with her brother over silly inside jokes. A woman excited to start her career. A daughter who left behind all her belongings and all her dreams when she vanished into thin air. The Bradleys didn't want her remembered as a ghost or a face on a poster. They wanted her back. In 2010, the case reappeared on television in an episode of Disappeared, reigniting interest. True crime enthusiasts, amateur sleuths, and advocacy groups began taking deeper looks at cruise ship security protocols. Some theorized Amy had been drugged and carried off the ship disguised as a crew member or hidden in a laundry cart. Others pointed to inconsistencies in interviews with certain staff members, especially those last seen interacting with her. But no hard evidence ever surfaced, and so the theories multiplied. Had she been handed over to traffickers as part of a deal? Was there a coordinated network operating from inside the ship, using the crews as cover? Could it have been something far simpler? An opportunistic predator who acted alone? The lack of closure meant all options remained open, and in that space, that terrible ambiguity, the imagination became both weapon and wound. In later years, the Bradleys began to speak less publicly. Exhaustion had taken its toll. They had spent years opening every door, following every shadow, confronting every possibility. And it had cost them dearly. Health, finances, sanity. But they never declared Amy dead, legally or emotionally. They kept her room, maintained her email account, continued checking in with the FBI. They understood the odds, but they also understood something else. Strange things happen. Survivors are found. And sometimes, the ocean gives back what it's taken. Even now, new technology continues to offer glimmers of hope. Facial recognition software has been used to scan images from tourist photos taken during the cruise. AI aging tools have been applied to old pictures. But nothing definitive has ever emerged. Still, the story refuses to die. There's a reason Amy's disappearance remains one of the most infamous unsolved cruise cases in modern history. It's not just the circumstances, it's the emotional aftermath, the chilling possibility that someone could be taken in plain sight, in a controlled environment, surrounded by people, and never seen again. It's the terrifying silence that followed, the institutional indifference, the loss not just of a person, but of trust. And every time a cruise ship leaves port, someone out there remembers Amy Lynn Bradley. Because the sea didn't just swallow her, it swallowed the truth. It's been over 25 years since Amy Lynn Bradley vanished, a quarter of a century marked not by healing, but by waiting. The kind of waiting that mutates into something else. A life paused, stretched endlessly between before and after. The Bradleys never stopped aging, but Amy, in every memory, every photo, remains 23. Young, hopeful, frozen in time, as if the clock never ticked past that Caribbean morning in 1998. And yet, in so many ways, Amy never left. Her face still stares from missing person posters. Her name is still whispered in Reddit threads and true crime documentaries. Her story still sparks arguments in cruise industry panels and victim advocacy summits. She lives on in policy changes, in better surveillance procedures, more transparent safety protocols, and the establishment of maritime security legislation like the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, which passed years after her disappearance. Amy never saw justice, but her absence forced the world to reckon with a terrifying truth: that safety at sea is an illusion. Ron and Iva still carry her story like a wound that never closes. They've spoken of the guilt, the helplessness, the torment of imagining what she may have endured, or is still enduring. They've also spoken of resilience, of community, of the strangers who joined their cause, lit candles, printed flyers, sent tips, even prayed. For years, Amy's face has been part of a quiet army of the missing. Faces most people forget. But Amy's story is different. Her vanishing is too calculated, too deliberate. Not just a tragedy, a crime. In one of their last public interviews, Iva Bradley said something that has echoed across every article written since. "We don't want to find a body. We want to find Amy." And that's the cruelest part. Hope, in this story, isn't a blessing. It's a burden. Because every moment that Amy isn't found means she could still be alive. Somewhere. And if she's alive, it means she's still waiting too. That possibility, however remote, is what keeps the Bradleys going. What haunts them? What defines their every waking hour? In recent years, awareness around human trafficking has grown. Documentaries, podcasts, exposés, all have helped cast light on the hidden underworld that may have swallowed Amy whole. Survivors have come forward from unimaginable situations, and some of them lived for decades in captivity. That truth gives the Bradleys fuel. The idea that maybe, just maybe, someone will recognize Amy, that she might find a way to signal, to escape, that a miracle, however overdue, is still possible. The ocean remains silent. The ship's logs are closed. The passengers are scattered across the world, and the cruise line has long since moved on, offering vacation packages and tropical promises with no trace of the horror that unfolded on that March morning. But for those who followed this case, for those who saw the look in Amy's eyes in her last known footage, forgetting simply isn't an option. Because Amy Lynn Bradley didn't just disappear. She was taken, and until she is found, her story will continue to echo, not just across the waves, but deep in the hearts of everyone who refuses to accept that a person can simply vanish from a cruise ship and never be seen again. Not without someone knowing something. Not without someone being responsible.